Cartoon Crossroads Columbus acknowledges that the ancient ancestors of the eastern woodland tribes, now referred to as the Dina and Hopo cultures, inhabited the land we now know as Ohio. Their descendants included the living nations of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandotte, Delaware, and Seneca Cayuga. We honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this place where we gather. We'd also like to thank some of our sponsors. Thank you to all of our sponsors, including the Greater Columbus Arts Council, the Ohio Arts Council, White Castle, and UBS, as well as an active clicker, as well as these sponsors. And these sponsors and donors. So today we're here to discuss Women's Comix, which turned 50 this year. Very exciting. I'm assuming all of you know what Women's Comix are, but in case you don't, it is the first ongoing all-women's anthology. And with us today we have Trina Robbins and Lee Mars, who are two of the founding mothers of the series. I'm going to introduce them, even though they really don't need any introduction, starting with Lee. So Lee's best known for The Further Fattening Adventures of Pudge, Girl Blimp, which was nominated for an Eisner in 2017. She was also a frequent contributor to Underground Comix, as we've covered, and one of the founding mothers of Women's Comix, as well as Gay Comics. Trina is an award-winning historian and writer. She's been writing books, comics, and graphic novels for over 50 years. She has written and drawn comics from Wonder Woman to Barbie. Her 2009 book, The Brinkley Girls, the best of Nell Brinkley's cartoons from 1930 to 1940, and her 2011 book, Tarpe Mills and Miss Fury, were nominated for Eisner Awards and Harvey Awards. Her all-ages graphic novel, Chicagoland Detective Agency, The Drained Brain Caper, first in a 6-book series, was a Junior Library Guild selection. Her graphic novel, Lily Renee, Escape Artist, was awarded a gold medal from Moonbeam Children's Books and a silver medal from Sidney Taylor Jewish Library Awards. This is her most recent book, but it's not. The Flapper Queens, which is about women cartoonists of the Jazz Age, won an Eisner in 2021. Her most recent book is the Gladys Parker book, which will be available to be signed after this is over. And in 2013, she was voted into the Will Eisner Hall of Fame. And as a reminder, we will have signings after this panel right outside. So you're welcome to come out there, purchase books, and get them signed. And I guess now
So who are you?
Oh, that is a good question, Lee. I am a PhD student here at OSU in the history department. I research and write about comics, which is why I'm here. And I've done several panels with Trina on romance comics and her comics. This is my first panel with Lee, which I'm very excited about, and that is who I am. Let me get my water. Okay. I'm going to have to turn around a lot.
She wins for best shoes. Is
Quite
this
the honor.
working? Is this working?
Is Trina's mic working? Speak into it.
Hello? Is it working? It's working.
It's harder to tell from up here. Okay, so first question. What is on here? Okay. We are going to talk a little bit about what led into the creating of Women's Comix, which starts with a bit about Trina's story. Oh my gosh. There we go. And I cannot see. The It Ain't Me Babe comic.
Yes. Okay, so we're going back first to 1970. It Ain't Me Babe was the first feminist newspaper in the country. I had at the time thought it was the first in the West Coast, but turns out it was the first in the entire country. And I joined the staff. It was, of course, called a women's liberation paper, not a feminist paper, because that's the term we used. I joined the staff in 1970, having freshly arrived from New York to San Francisco and discovering that the underground comics group there was a closed boys' club, and they didn't want me. But the newspapers, the underground papers wanted me, so I was already doing stuff for the underground newspapers, who phoned me as soon as they found out that I was in San Francisco, and then someone showed me the second issue of It Ain't Me, Babe, and I got so excited. And I phoned the staff immediately and met them at a Bee Inn in Golden Gate Park. And after that, I was just, every 3 weeks, I was taking the bus to Berkeley, from San Francisco to Berkeley, to do covers for It Ain't Me, Babe, and a comic for the back page of It Ain't Me, Babe. And soon I felt brave enough, because I had their moral support, not their monetary support, because no one had any money, but their moral support, that I can do my own damn comic book. I don't need those guys. So I did my own damn comic book, It Ain't Me, Babe. And it was the very, very first all-woman comic book in the world. Who knows, maybe the universe.
Yay!
And there were a couple of women who had already done comics, and they contributed. Most notably was Willie Mendez, who was my friend and also lived in San Francisco. She did 8 pages and the back cover. I did the front cover, and I think about 12 pages. And other than that, we found women who could draw, and we said, want to do a comic? And they went, yeah. So that's how we filled the book.
Yeah, and then was this in women's, or this was in women's?
That's from Women's.
And then how did It Ain't Me, Babe turn into women's?
2 years passed.
No.
2 years passed, and our publisher, Ron Turner, I have to say, we owe so much to Ron. Ron, I consider him the father of women cartoonists, because he published It Ain't Me, Babe, and he published women's comics. He did much more, but he's a great guy. He is still with us. 2 years later, It Ain't Me, Babe had been reprinted several times, and he wanted to do another, we still called it Women's Liberation, another Women's Liberation comic. And at that point, I didn't want to do it. I think I was burned out. And I had been doing my own comics also. But Patricia Moodian, who worked for Ron, got together 10 women, 9 women, and Patricia makes 10, meeting in her cute little bungalow in San Francisco, and we produced women's comics. And I have to say, how we found the title, we couldn't think of what to call it. And we kept saying, what shall we call this women's comic? And we realized we were saying the name.
Is that how you got involved? How you remember this starting of Women's Comics League?
Sure. I was running around. I was doing alternative feature service, which with a couple of guys, and so I had seen underground comics. I thought I could do my own comic. And so I did a story and then took it to all of the underground publishers. When I hit Ron Turner, he said, this would be fabulous. It'll come out later this year if you can do a whole comic yourself. But meanwhile, there's a group of women who are going to meet in a few weeks, and I'll put you in touch with Pat Moodian. So that's how I joined Women's Comics.
And you both worked on the first issue?
Yes.
Yes.
And is this what that story, Sandy Comes Out, is
Yes,
from the first
Sandy
issue?
Comes Out, the very first comic about an out lesbian. And that's mine, and it's the story of my roommate, Sandy Pauls. She was Robert Crumb's sister, and she left her husband and came to San Francisco. And Crumb, in a typical stupid male fashion, was asking all his male cartoonist friends if they wanted Sandy to come live with them. And I said, wait a minute. And I phoned her, and I said, hi, this is Trina Robbins. You want to come live with me? And she said, yeah. So this is Sandy's story. And I did it with Sandy, with her approval, and I gave her the originals. And there's a story there, too, because Sandy died, and I thought, oh, no, what's happened to my originals? And her son, Avery, wound up living 2 doors down from me on the same block. So we had lunch. He was a really nice guy. And he told me that she had given the originals to her lover, the woman who was her lover when she died. But that woman died, and she gave the originals to her son. This is, through the years, this is what happened. And her son passed the originals on to Avery. And I said, Avery, you should keep them because it's about your mother. But I would like really, really good high-resolution scans so I can print from it and exhibit it. And he hasn't done that yet, but he has said he will.
And then we have this cover of number 3.
Yep,
Yes.
it is.
Yeah, it's a fact.
That's it.
Would you like to speak to that? Like, we're just going to go through and look at some of these. We also have, Lee, I believe this is your story. Do you want to
Yeah.
talk about this?
We did, of course, hundreds of stories over the years. To do a short story, which was always the thing in an anthology, I often did parodies. And there were these commercials, so I did a commercial parody. Over the year, well, very quickly, I guess by the 3rd issue, we realized that since we were the only anthology, that there were all these women who wanted to publish comics but didn't have any access. And so we vowed that we would devote half of the book to new cartoonists. And we got submissions from everywhere, eventually internationally as well. But we understood, we made a conscious choice. We understood that therefore the book wouldn't get progressively better over the years. There would always be beginners in it. But this was political, and we were heavily into that back in the day.
And on that note, how did you see women's fitting into the broader feminist movement? Did you see it fitting into it, or did you see it as a separate movement, or working with it?
Well, we saw it as part of the feminist movement. Other people had different ideas.
A lot of feminists accepted us.
Yes.
It was carried in women's bookstores. But there were always hardcore people, who, comics,
In addition to comics, it was the variety of stories that we did. There were bookstores that would only cover lesbian stories. And of course, a lot of our stories had guys in them, even if they were being stabbed. That counted, They weren't interested in any penises, and Ms. Magazine wouldn't print our ad, and there are a variety of stories.
I
both
had to
positive
explain
and
that about Ms., though.
Okay.
The Supreme Court had passed a ruling that put pornography, decisions about pornography, in the hands of the separate states, so that some states could consider something perfectly fine, other states could consider it pornographic. And certain states considered women's comics pornographic, and they just didn't want to get in trouble. So that's why they wouldn't carry our ads. I think it's completely understandable.
I don't.
We disagree.
You both talked about sort of what went into making your own stories and a bit about working with other women, but I was wondering if you could speak to the process of creating an issue of women's comics.
We put on boxing gloves.
Naturally.
We would sit, really, once a month that we met? Once a month, we would sit on the floor surrounded by submissions. It was amazing. In the first issue, we asked for submissions, and they came rolling in. And we would just, we had an editor, but the editor she had the final decision, but we all made decisions. It was definitely a collective. And we would just choose what we liked, and some things we all agreed were terrible, And some things we agreed were wonderful. I remember the first Roberta Gregory story. I think that was in 1974, issue number 4, because we had about one issue a year. And it was wonderful, and we loved her immediately, all of us. And that's how we decided.
The meetings were always cordial because of enhanced brownies.
That would help.
The meetings went from one person's house to the next person's house to the next person's house. So, and how we decided who was going to be the editor was probably the most troubled decisions we made, because nobody wanted to be the editor. You didn't get paid for this. It was totally time-consuming. You were the one who had to correspond with everybody all over the world, and it was a complete pain in the ass. So, but whoever lost drawing straws was the editor.
Later, we made it easier because we had co-editors.
Yeah.
We had 2 women editing, and that sure did make it easier.
Now, working throughout women's comics, are there any particular memories that stand out to you? Lee's laughing, so I'm guessing yes.
You go first.
We went down to San Diego, sort of as a group, a few of us, to do our first selling of women's comics.
That was 1977.
Yep. And it was a blast. It was in the El Cortez Hotel, this ancient Fleabag hotel, and all of the creators gathered around the pool. And it had umbrellas around it and everything. And there was an extension of the hotel above the pool. And there were 2 stories. And so a few of the women's comics people, either drunk or having enhanced their consciousness, dove off or jumped off of the balcony into the pool.
Fully dressed.
I thought that was fun.
That does sound fun.
And they pulled Harvey Kurtzman into the pool, also fully dressed.
Oh, that's great. What's your memory, Trina?
Well, that's one of the memories, really. That was my first San Diego con, and it was just amazing. And I didn't know they were planning on giving, at that point they didn't have Eisners, but they had Inkpot Awards, and I had no idea that they were planning on giving me an Inkpot Award. And those of us who were being given the award were seated on the stage. It was a combined dinner and award ceremony. And I was really annoyed because my boyfriend was down on the floor and I was on the stage. And why did they do that? I didn't know. And none of us knew. And Hap Klebon, who did the famous Klebon Cats, he also got an award. And he was so surprised that he knocked his chair over in his haste to get up and accept the award. It was really fantastic.
And he often smoked cigars. And the cigar went one way and he went the other. It was vastly entertaining.
That's great. Now, Lee, I think this is one of your stories again that's up. And I was wondering if you could speak to that one.
I've always been quite political, and this is one of the most overt political stories I've done. It involves the future, where the sexes get so pissed with each other that the women leave the planet. And so the story is about what happens through the eyes of a mother and her little girl.
That sounds really good. And then, Trina, I wanted to go back and have you explain this
Oh,
cover.
This
It's one of my
is
favorite
a riot
covers.
because it's the 21st Century Woman. We did it in, I think, in 1982. And a lot of the women, the women's comics women, made suggestions that I incorporated. And it's very funny, of course. Let's see.
We have the computerized cassette briefcase.
The sexually synthesized gyration, bionic leg structure. Actually, I have a bionic knee, so that part is true. Artificial womb, mammary lactation device, June Cleaver Memorial Biorhythmic Necklace. It was a lot of fun. But I mean, it's so funny now because somehow when we did this in 1982, we weren't thinking, gosh, we'll all still be alive in the 21st century.
I'm still waiting on my computerized cassette briefcase.
Yes.
Over the time, we began to come up with themes for the issues because we found this sold better. Yay. So we did the bicentennial issue and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I noticed there was like a super issue that was back. There it goes. That one, but Women at Work.
Oh, I love
Yep,
that one.
yes. This is my favorite cover that I've ever done.
The bicentennial issue. Do you have the cover for that one?
I
No.
don't
Okay,
think
that one was done by
included.
Shari Flanagan, and it's just brilliant. It's George Washington is handing Betsy Ross the material for the American flag and saying, "Can you have it done in a week?" And she's frowning fiercely, and it says she wanted to lead the charge at Gettysburg.
Lee, do you want to speak to why was this your favorite cover that you've ever done?
Well, I spent a lot of time planning it. How do you get all these different characters in one image? And how can you make clear their relationship and all that? So it took a lot of engineering, for one thing. But I think it came out quite well.
I love this one.
Yeah.
Trina, what do you love about it?
What do I love about it?
Yeah.
Well, it's just, Lee has a wonderful sense of humor, and it's just very funny. I mean, each one of them wants to do what the other does.
That is how it goes. Oh, and then this, I actually think, I said the other one was my favorite, but I believe this is my favorite.
This is my
cover
favorite of
yours.
my women's comics covers, definitely. This is the one I always exhibit.
It's a nice play on romance comics.
Yes, exactly.
And then we're moving on to a little bit of what came out.
Sex.
Yeah, a little bit of sex, and what came out of women's comics.
Well, Dennis Kitchen, who was a different publisher, a different comics publisher, asked me if to edit a women's comics anthology. And we were already doing women's comics, so there was no need for that. And the guys, at this point, the guys in the underground were all doing graphic sex. So I said, the hell with that, let's us do sex. And I came up with the title, Wet Satin, Women's Erotic Fantasies. And immediately, and I got the book together, and it was wonderful. I mean, I just got the best of the group to be in it, you know? And the editor, the printer, this was in the Midwest. The printer would not print it.
Midwest.
The printer refused to print it. He said it was pornography. So Dennis Kitchen had a publishing company called Kitchen Sink, and it just so happened that one of the books he published, which was all male, was called Bizarre Sex, and it was so out there that there was one cover that they couldn't even show on newsstands. They had to show it with a white piece of paper over it. So I said, how come you can print Bizarre Sex, but you can't print Wet Satin? He said, oh, Bizarre Sex is satire.
Lee, I think you did the next cover.
Yes.
This is one of my more subtle works. That's also one of my favorites.
It's very good.
And this is the back cover. I think this is the back cover to women's
women's
comics,
comic,
from
yeah.
our women's comics.
Oh, okay.
These are all the dreams, and
Let's go. Oh,
this is, yeah, these are all the dreams that folks have, all at a bus stop.
and then,
The thing that I'm most known for is the Pudge Girl Blimp series. And I had started it before I got into women's comics. The first issue was printed by Ron Turner, and then the Star Reach Productions took over. This is the cover to the third issue. As you can see, just like Charles Schulz, I'm interested in really clean, neat lines. You don't want any clutter if you're going to do a cover.
nothing that's busy.
No, not at all. Yes,
Good eye.
and Captain Kangaroo. But they're actually not those two, they're actually two Martians.
Now, for those of the very few people in the room who wouldn't know what Pudge is about, would you care to explain?
It's the story of a teenage girl who runs away to San Francisco to get laid. And instead, she goes through, kind of like Candide, many adventures having to do with work. She gets to live in a commune, and she keeps getting foiled while she's trying to get laid. She does eventually get laid.
Thank goodness. And then we have, oh yeah, okay.
Choices.
So we have choices. And Trina, would you like to speak on
Yes. I think this was 1990, and the Supreme Court passed what is commonly known as the Webster decision, and that put the decisions about abortion in the hands of the individual states. And we knew what was going to happen, and indeed it has happened, hasn't it? So I decided that I needed to do a pro-choice anthology. In this case, the benefit was NOW, the National Organization for Women, and I had to publish this myself. Nobody would publish it. I published it myself, and my co-editor was Liz Schiller, who was the treasurer of Oakland and NOW, so we had clout. And of course, Lee did the cover.
What was it like working on this cover?
I immediately thought of how getting pregnant was fabulous for some women, and we really wanted to happen. And for other people, it was tragic and a real problem. So I wanted to picture both of them with the oppression of the government above that. So I came up with this.
And I'd like to add that Lee is doing a comic for yet another pro-choice anthology because it's time, because of our rogue Supreme Court, I am publishing another pro-choice anthology. This time the money is going to Planned Parenthood. Lee is one of the contributors.
We are all, of course, very excited about that.
Buy the book.
Yes,
buy the book.
And that kind of leads into my two last questions before we open it up to the Q&A for the room, and you can answer them together or separate. But one, we've already gone over it a bit, but how did working in women's affect other parts of your career or life? Do you see it really connected to the rest of your work? And two, what effects do you think women has had on the comics community, both in terms of like consumers, publishers, creators?
Well, women's comics opened the door, really. You know, there were no comics by women. Marvel and DC were only publishing superheroes. The comic book stores, you had to buy, if you wanted to buy a comic, you had to go to a comic book store. Before that, you could go to your neighborhood candy store or drugstore or wherever and buy comics. But by then, you could only buy them in comic book stores. The comic book stores only wanted to carry superheroes for boys. They didn't welcome girls into their stores. So there were no women. There were no women drawing comics. So we broke it. You know, we broke the glass ceiling, or whatever you want to call the newsprint ceiling. And we published comics for women. And other women went, whoa, I can do that too. And the result is what you see today, which is like so many women, I can't count them, and so many books and so many graphic novels, and you don't have to do superheroes anymore if you don't want to. And we started it. We started it.
Well, first of all, as artists, we usually work alone. I'd been doing work for years as a cartoonist and as an illustrator and an animator, and it was kind of lonely. But the first tribe I ever belonged to was women's comics, that group of women, and we were there for people's births, their weddings, all kinds of things. And so that gave me a grounding that has helped me ever since. Internationally, although we were all inspired by Binky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary by Justin Green,
I was not.
some of us were were impressed by this. We began to see, particularly in Europe, people doing personal story graphics. And we're actually in several academic tomes from Denmark with various illustrations from our work. And I felt very proud about that because although there is a graphic history in Europe that's much more varied than the United States, the chance for women to tell their stories really came from us.
Anana, which was this, it lasted 7 issues, an ongoing comic magazine that came from France, reprinted us. And that started in '77, and that was incredible to be printed in France, and also to see the work of other women cartoonists, European women cartoonists, and they were better than us. They were really incredible, and that just really opened us up. And the other thing, of course, is that, as Lee said, women's comics was a safe place. I mean, we'd go out for coffee together, go out for drinks. We would do things together. It was truly a safe place.
A sisterhood.
Yes, it was.
Trina, I remember at Comic-Con you had mentioned Willie showing up to take you to a museum one day after you'd been working on, I think, one of your comics. I don't remember which one, but that really struck me.
Say that again?
When Willie had shown up one day to take you to a museum after you had been working all day, you both went with your children.
Oh, yeah, I thought you said it at Comic-Con. Oh, I told you that
Yeah,
at
you
Comic-Con.
told me that at Comic-Con,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we were both in San Francisco, and I was very isolated. I had a new baby, and nobody cared. You know, it was me and my baby. The guys, like I say, were, you know, as far as they were concerned, I didn't exist, or they wished that I would not exist. And one day, you know, when it had been a particularly hard day, Willie Mendez showed up and said, let's go to the Asian Museum. And just, you know, she was a true friend.
Now, I also think that your work extends beyond just the comics community, because I think it's allowed for us to, even in the world of history, to research women's comics and not just superhero comics. And the way that I found your and Lee's work was through your book on Girls, Girls, and Girls. And so do you see your work on your historian work connected to the similar, like what drove you to do women's comic? And Lee, do you have any similar
Say
experiences?
that again.
Does your work on women's history connect to what drove you to do women's comics?
Well, of course. I mean, you know, in the very first history of women cartoonists that I did, which was with Cat Ironwood, we would tell people we're working on a history of women cartoonists, and they would go, "Oh, that'll be a slim volume."
Trina, how
Little
many-
did they know.
Yeah.
How many volumes have you written on women's cartoonists and comics?
Okay, there was Women and the Comics. There was a Century of Women Cartoonists. There was the second Women and the Comics. There was my book on superheroines, and finally Pretty in Pink. Pretty in Ink, God. Those 5 books, 5 histories, specific histories about women cartoonists, but then I've also done specific books about specific women, like the Brinkley Girls and the Flapper Queens and the Tarpey Mills collection.
And Gladys Parker.
And the Gladys Parker book, my latest one, yes.
And then when did you do the women's anthology?
When did that come out? 2013?
2 years?
No,
No.
later than that.
Who knows? We're
I
old.
feel like it was 2013. Okay, I think
That's a door stopper.
it is. It's very
It's-
heavy.
It's like this.
And they charge by the pound.
Yep, yep.
Oh, we were all
you.
wrong.
Thank you, audience.
Okay, I think unless you two have anything else you want to add, we can open up to questions to the audience.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, and also, how are we doing the questions? Do we pass around a mic, or do you just shout it out? Just go, you. Yeah, you. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, just looking back on what you've done, if you had, if there was anything you wish or you would have done differently, especially insofar as you see publishing comics as, women's comics as a feminist act, like, is there anything you wish you'd done differently in order to represent different women better?
I think we did a pretty damn good job.
I wish we had gotten paid.
Oh, that.
Yes, I cannot see your face, but in the red sweater, yes.
So this question is for Lee, but if Trina has relevance or relevant experience, you can also answer. But I was wondering, Lee, you said you were an animator. How did the animation culture compare to the comics community? Was it also very much a boys' club at the time?
Yes. It was more varied. There was a scattering of women, not in control, but at least there were around, particularly in relation to the mainstream. And this was before the golden age of animation today. This was where animation was in commercials or self-published personal shorts that strangely got to compete with the Oscars, but there was almost no source for them. So then, once computer graphics came in, that started the revolution that has ended up with Pixar.
Dave, do you just want to be in charge of handing the mic to people? Okay, let's go to someone over here. Let's go to Rachel.
Hi. So I was wondering, you talked a little bit about kind of running into issues with publishers or folks not wanting to carry your anthology because they consider the content to be pornographic. And I was curious about, I know that there's like a contingent of a sector of feminists, like Women Against Pornography. So I was curious if either of you had any experience with your comics being received by that group of people, and if so, what was kind of your response or experience with that contingent of feminists at the time?
As far as I know, we did not. We did not get any flack from Women Against Pornography. The worst we got was the printer who wouldn't print us because he said we were pornographic.
I got negative feedback from a group, a women's group in Los Angeles, because I was making fun of fat people. And obviously they hadn't read the story at all, but it was a threatening letter. If I ever was found in Los Angeles, they would cut off my tits.
I forgot that we did get a threatening letter. Women's Comics got a threatening letter, and I saved it. It was wonderful. It was. They didn't sign their names. Instead, they just drew a labyrinth, which is like supposedly an Amazon weapon, and they called us crew-cut she-pricks. And they said, "You're not women at all. You're the FBI." They said, "Never mind, you will find justice at our hands."
Conspiracies everywhere, back through the eons of time.
Okay, we had two more people over here, so let's give them each turn. Right there. Starting, yes, that.
Yes, as far as the era, I think it's really interesting that you were coming up right after everything that had been happening with, the very early times with Seduction of the Innocent and EC Comics going under and everything else. And then just, in your late teens, early 20s, you guys are really pushing the envelope as far as what comics can do politically, artistically, and everything else. Do you feel that you were impacted at all, that you were coming right off of time where there was such a significant backlash against comics and that it would drive young people crazy and all this? Was that at all sort of in your subconscious when you guys were
I
doing
think
everything?
that was several years before.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
This is the early 70s, so.
As far as when you were younger, just growing up, as far as like that you were just coming right off of that a little bit.
No, I was a fan of Batman, so.
And we all read Mad.
Yes.
We loved Mad. I think Mad formed us. Now, I started in '66, and really, the backlash was way over. The backlash was the 50s.
Is anyone in the, wait, there's one more person here with the, yes, the green shirt.
Okay, just really practical. If you didn't get paid, how did you survive?
That's a good question.
I was on welfare. I was a single mother. I was on welfare. And as far as I'm concerned, artists, like in Holland, the artists are supported by the state. I think we should have been supported by the state too. And I was.
I did other artwork. I did a few stories for the mainstream and started an animation company, an art agency and an animation company. And that lasted for 30 years.
And now reprints are getting residuals from the
Residuals, oh. No.
Does anyone in the back have questions? Yes, someone over there, gray shirt, beard.
Wait till the microphone gets you.
Please.
Da-da-la-la, da-da-la-la, dun-dun, dun-dun-la-la-la.
So this question is for Lee. I have gathered the back issues of Pudge over the years, really enjoyed the story, but was kind of curious if the inclusion of the alien subplot was part of a mandate from the publisher Starreach, or if that was always in the plan.
That was in the first issue, which was put out by Last Gasp Echo Funnies. So, no, there was no editing done as far as Pudge was concerned,
They
which
never
is now
told us what to
available
print.
in a complete issue.
That's
for
probably
sale.
being sold tomorrow, right?
Yes, at the expo.
Make sure to come to the expo.
They never told us what to print. Never.
Let's get another question. Yes, in the front, in the really nice jean jacket.
I was really interested in your point about how comic stores actually made comics less accessible to women, and I'm wondering how the development of direct distribution also affected women's comics.
I have such resentment against the comic book stores. They killed women's comics. They really did, because they wouldn't carry it. The last issue has an editorial by Karen Leshin, who was the editor at the time, and she talks about how if they ordered it at all, they would order like 2 issues, and then when they sold out, they wouldn't reissue. And you would ask them why, and they would say, women don't read comics. You know, it was this circular thing. And they didn't just kill women's comics. I mean, I attempted to do girls' comics in the 80s, and they just didn't carry them, or they would get like 2 or 3 issues and not reorder. And this wasn't just my problem. This happened to other women, happened to any women who tried to do something for women and girls. They killed our comics.
And we know for a fact that Trina's girls' comics were popular because we have tons of fan letters at the Billie Ireland.
That's right. That's right. Somebody who was doing research in fan mail read my fan mail, which I contributed. I mean, it was huge stacks of mail. And I gave it to the Billie Ireland Museum, and the people who were doing the research were totally blown out about how many letters said, I love your comics, but I can never find them.
Yes, Andy has a question. And sorry, the blazer, blue shirt. Oh, yeah, that's true.
I just wanted to ask Lee, and since you also contributed to the very first issue of Gay Comics, what was that experience like in relationship to the first, starting of women's comics? And Trina, I know you were involved. You got the first letter of solicitation for contributors, and you were essential in networking with other creators to help Howard Cruz out on that. If you could both talk about the experience with the initiation of Gay Comics.
I knew Howard because both of us were from Alabama, and we both escaped as soon as we could. My mate, Mike Friedrich, was Howard Cruz's agent, and so he got DC Comics to publish Stuck Rubber Baby. So I'm forever grateful for that process. And actually, Alternative Features Service, which I was running when I ran into Trina and hired Trina, actually.
Yes.
We hired Howard to create Barefoots for that, and that was his first published work. So Howard, he sent out a solicitation. I'm having trouble with letter, and to just about everybody in the industry, and I was so delighted to hear that this was going on. So I contribute. At the time, I was what Howard said was that I was one of the name brand people. And considering how my career was going at the time, that was really sad. But I decided not to get back to him about that. But none of us met each other. Besides that, all of the contributors lived in different places. But there again, Howard gave you as many pages as you wanted to do whatever you wanted to do. So it was very positive for me.
I'd like to just start because Lee mentioned the syndicate that she was doing, and that they published me. That this is such a good example of sisterhood. First of all, I was so grateful to do something for this, just to be published, and yeah, I think it was it weekly or monthly?
It was weekly.
Weekly. She knew that I was living alone with my baby, so she came to my house to get the weekly work. She came to me to get the weekly work. I didn't have to go to her. And this, Lee,
This was before women's comics.
Yes. And about Howard and gay comics, I have already told you that when I got that letter, because I had met Howard, my first reaction was I should have known he's such a nice guy, because he was announcing to the whole underground comics world that he was gay. And I have to tell you that those guys were a bunch of homophobic idiots, and he was so brave to do this. And I thought it was wonderful, but because I am straight, I didn't send anything until Robert Triptow took over as editor, and he specifically invited me into the book, because after all, I am a friend of Dorothy. And it was wonderful to be accepted by the gay cartoonists, when the straight guys didn't accept me.
Who has better taste?
Good point. We probably have time for one or two more questions, depending on the question. So let's get there's a man up here in the corner.
Yeah, I was just wondering, your relationship with the guys back then I've always just kind of assumed that you guys all got along fairly well. Was it not like that? Was there a lot of division between, you guys and the, Crumb and S.
Well, there was for me. I mean, the guys, there was a clique. I want to say not all of the men were horrible assholes, but there was a clique. And the clique consisted of the most well-known of the underground cartoonists.
Huh.
And they just, as far as they were concerned, as I've said, I was invisible.
Has that gotten better?
Well, some of them are dead by now. I'm still not really friends with them.
I didn't have as much trouble. I think there was a variety of opinions and friendliness. We had lots of parties where instead of being done in by dope and booze, we discussed the latest crow quill pen, or where could you order the most Bristol board for the least amount of money and keep the quality up. But there are a variety of responses and closeness.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Down in front.
Yes, down in front. We're just making Dave run everywhere.
You're getting a workout, sir.
You're welcome.
This question is for Lee. I first encountered your work when I was, I guess, a young teenager on a magazine or a comic book called Plop.
This was like a month ago or
Right, I know. I didn't age as well as you did, but a comic book called Plop, which I don't think you wrote the features, but you drew them. And I was just wondering how you got involved and what that experience was like. And that Plop wasn't quite exactly a mainstream comic in the sense that it had Sergio Aragonés and Basil Wolverton and Wally Wood.
Alex Toth.
I didn't know that.
This was a book that DC Comics put out. Joe Orlando, who had come from Mad Magazine, wanted to put out DC's version of Mad Magazine. And he battled with the powers that be for years. And then finally they said, okay, you can do this one title. And I was mentored by Tex Blaisdell, who did the backgrounds for Prince Valiant, Little Orphan Annie, High and Lois, a lot of comic strips. He was the father of my college roommate. And so Tex introduced me to Joe, who looked over my portfolio and said, I have just the job for you. So 2 years later, he called up. I was living in San Francisco by then, and he said that he would like for me. I first wrote and drew stories, but then it turned out he had a huge backlog of stories that he had paid for from his no sense of humor old buddies. So he would send me these unfunny stories, and I was assigned to make them funny and then draw them. And I mailed them back and forth to him. I was one of the first people to live outside of New York to do mainstream work. That was a good gig. It went on for years.
Thanks to FedEx. In the beginning, in the early days of comics, you had to live in New York and deliver your work in person.
Okay, I think that wraps up our time, but could we please give another hand for these wonderful women?